Gen Z has witnessed a political revolution across the span of our lives that is likely to define the trajectory of humanity. Where we go is still undetermined, but we know we're certainly going somewhere. Because it looks to be that our civilization is gearing up for battle. And it's going to be winner take all. In one corner, you have the globalists, billionaires, and leftists, all desperate to destroy the West and the genetic homogeneity of whites. With a fatal injection of multiculturalism, they want to turn the populace into one big bowl of homogenous slop that can be ruled over by a select class of techno-futurists. And they plan on using AI to finally establish this top-down form of government. And if they do end up seizing this power, then their civilizational panopticon can finally emerge once and for all, and with it, we would see the last phase of the managerial revolution ushered in. Perpetual control of an eternal underclass. But in the other corner, you have racist Gen Z men who are doing everything in their power to earn back as much of their testosterone that was stolen from them. These rebels have all somehow successfully fought off the omnipresent liberal programming, and they're ready for the fight. They want their countries and cultures back. They may be the underdogs, but they have something that the opposition doesn't. Nothing to lose. But many liberal normies have been asking themselves, what the hell is going on? How did we get here? Why are young men unironically calling for women's voting rights to be stripped? They want to end all immigration, denaturalize and deport? Why do people keep saying the painter was right? What is going on? Some try and rebut this budding right-wing energy outright. They'll usually write it off as some sort of sexual frustration manifesting in the form of politics. Incels, they scream. They'll say we're losers who are obsessed with having a victim complex. They'll say we're radicalized. How utterly ironic. So, I'm going to explain in depth why so many previously liberal young men are now, and will continue to become, men of the right. Not conservatives, not constitutionalists, not classical liberals, but men of the right. To understand the transformation, we need to look at just how entrenched the liberal programming is in our culture. There are not, and perhaps have never been, genuinely competing political points of view in the West. Conservatism and liberalism actually operate under the same fundamental beliefs. It's just a matter of pace which distinguishes the two ideologies, nothing more. And Michael Malice has a great line for this. Conservatives are progressives going the speed limit. This is obvious given how many modern conservatives would be considered far more liberal than almost any 90s Democrat. And that's because mainstream conservative views are all relative to the current cultural mood. Each side of the American political dichotomy differs in degree, but not in kind. True right-wing foundations, which are definite and immovable, are rarely asserted from the conservatives. If we did use right-wing principles, our stances wouldn't fall prey to whatever was merely popular at the time. This is because actual right-wing principles are founded on definitions, not context, and they would never be subject to change based on a popular vote. So why isn't that what we see on the American right? Why do we see conservatives largely support gay marriage if it contradicts their supposed principles? Because what pervades American conservatism is not actually a right-wing ideology. American conservatism has been captured by the fundamentals of liberalism, and it has never been able to divorce itself from this. But to understand why we have found ourselves in a world which until very recently was incapable of rejecting liberal priors requires an understanding of what was preached in our public education system. The first, most basic fundamental principle that was implied was that we had reached the end of history. This is a term coined by Francis Fukuyama, and it theorized that the world had essentially figured out government. It insisted that Western liberal democracy was inevitable, and the democratization of power would come for all. As the concept of a king was slandered as an abomination to the human spirit, the god of democracy was raised up as the rightful ruler of man. Because we were civilized now, we voted for what we wanted, we created our own change, we raised ourselves, because we were now our own gods. But even if we thought we had finally figured out the whole government thing, that didn't exonerate us from what we had done in the past. Can you imagine hating someone for the color of their skin, they would scream. How could any person be considered better than another? The thought of putting someone in chains just because they were more resistant to sunburns. Oh yes, we had sins and they wouldn't ever be forgotten. And there was something almost cathartic about it when we embraced it, because they preyed on our good spirit. We wanted to make things right, and they knew that we were truly upset when we saw others being treated poorly. And we were taught that for thousands of years we, the whites, were so vile that it only took the sight of a slightly darker tone to transform us into rabid, violent animals. If our ancestors saw a poor black man fetching water from the creek, it was time to knot up the noose and find the nearest tree. And we believed this with all our hearts, and we were disgusted by it. So we tore through the pages to see Atticus Finch bravely defend an innocent black man in the deep South. What a hero. We watched the March in Selma in one of the many Ken Burns documentaries, and we bowed to Rosa Parks for her bravery on the bus that day. And it all became too much for us. The evidence was overwhelming. We were clearly an awful, evil group of people, and something had to be done to make it right. So we confessed, yes, we were bad, so what can we do about it? But atonement wouldn't be as simple as we hoped. While the left continued to march and chant for a world built on fairness, there were caveats to this. Even though they constantly invoked America's new god, Martin Luther King, this proposed world where we were to be judged on the content of our character and merit did have to be revised slightly, because it turned out that even up to this very day, it still wasn't even possible to evaluate non-whites based on merit. Society was apparently so entrenched with racism that these people never had a chance within the system to begin with. And so, as restitution for our ancestors' sins, we had to willingly step aside. Everyone else now had a right to all the positions of status and authority in our civilization, independent of their merit or character, just because it was their turn now. But surely, now that we had cleared the way for these people to get a fair shot, all this rampant inequality that we see in performance, income, IQ, everything would vanish. But it obviously didn't. And one of the most tragic parts about this was that American whites all wanted this to work. We thought this world could be possible. It was the end of history, after all, where everything should work out. And so affirmative action took its next step into officially becoming DEI. And we sat there patiently, hopeful and proud as these people were given these opportunities instead of us. Many were brought to tears when they saw a black man take the office of the presidency, even. But then the vitriol came, the hatred for whites. And it was obvious that this was no longer reconciliatory, it was vengeful. Equality wasn't enough. The repayment for our willful concession was suffering and subjugation. And we had no choice but to accept. The event which so obviously showcased this hatred was the Black Lives Matter revolution in 2014. And it was with the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where we felt the true heat of their wrath. And things would only escalate from there. Calls for reparations became a common topic of conversation in schools. Clubs which openly excluded whites formed. Our opinions were mocked and disregarded merely on account of our race. Every single thing became a matter of racism. Nothing could be viewed outside this critical lens. And it continued to get worse, as extremely qualified whites began getting denied from great colleges and missing out on jobs they were perfect fits for. We quickly realized that we were, in fact, now officially beneath these people. And yet, we couldn't help but notice that despite all the charity, all the extra efforts being made, all the concessions, none of these people were making any progress whatsoever. These inequalities still weren't going away. And so, after white Americans had graciously stepped aside to let those who claimed to have been unfairly treated have a try, what did we get? We got more racial hatred towards us. A complete desecration of our culture. We got unqualified people making a mockery of once great institutions while we were kept out. And it was then when a few of us had that incredible revolutionary thought. Perhaps there was more to our differences than just circumstance. And maybe there was a reason that we were at the front of the line before, and maybe we should be at the front of the line again. But we kept that thought as quiet as we could. Whites had been absolutely slandered like no other by society. But white women were in an interesting position. They were scolded for their race, but at the same time they were promoted for their gender. We'd hear, If it had been the Lehman sisters and not the Lehman brothers, we never would have had the 2008 financial crisis. It all would have been different if it wasn't for you, white men. And so if BLM was a racial retribution against whites, mainstream feminism was a gendered retribution against white men. Just like the racial movement, it had first been framed as reconciliatory. We just want women to have a fair shot. Why are all the brain surgeons men? What about the CEOs? Can't we have some proportional representation too? Our goodwill preyed upon again. We wanted that for them all. We wanted them to live good, fulfilling lives. Maybe they did need a shot. But just as with BLM, we quickly noticed the same pattern. These women didn't want equality. They didn't want autonomy. They simply hated men. And anything that could be done to destroy us, they would do gladly because they wanted revenge. But it was around this time when we were shown a very important lesson. And it was really this lesson which kickstarted the right-wing youth political revolution we still find ourselves in. And that very simple lesson was, you don't have an obligation to be nice to people who hate you. And with that revelation, Donald Trump rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the incinerated America of years past. Here was a man about as American as could be, telling us that it was actually good to be from America, to be American, and that we can return to a once great nation, which was our nation after all. He also told us that we didn't have to put up with things being shitty just because some faceless blob said that that was how things were. And shockingly, none of us had really heard that before. But now, we had a contradiction to work out. The inherent truth of Trump's message pulled on us in a primal way. We knew it was true, and there was no denying the energy of it. So then why was everyone saying that this was the worst, most evil man to ever live? The mighty New York Times said it. This was Hitler. And we were all confused. Because for our whole lives, the media had been portrayed to be an objective purveyor of truth. And many of us mostly just believed what they said outright. School had reaffirmed the honesty and integrity of the mainstream media's reporting. 60 Minutes was a constant in the classroom, and anytime there was breaking news, CNN would come on the projector to make sure we knew exactly what was going on. And we were told that these reporters had our best interest at heart, and they were simply chasing truth, until the lies became too blatant to ignore. A particularly distinct lie by the media, which likely red-pilled the most people at once, was the "find people on both sides" hoax. This was a watershed moment when many politically neutral people realized that the media was intentionally lying about Trump. And despite all the absurd journalistic hysteria pumping from every possible medium, no one was actually being rounded up. Blacks were in fact not being put back in chains, and immigrants weren't being shot on sight. Even though reality was not matching up with the narrative, a great majority still couldn't wean off what the mainstream was injecting us with. But a few of us did. And for those who started to finally wake up, it was obvious that the first Trump campaign had planted some seeds in the minds of young men who were, at the time, more or less checked out of politics. It let us at least begin to consider the vague possibility that perhaps it was okay to be white American men. Not good even, but at least acceptable. And maybe white men did some positive stuff for the world too. Back then, that was still an incredibly uncomfortable thought, especially given everything the media was putting out. But with the blatantness of that propaganda, this era finally showed us unequivocally that the media did have an agenda, and we can no longer assume that they were simply truth seekers. We had no idea where these revelations would lead to. But many of us were now taking some very small steps into the unknown. And with the eventual election of Trump in 2016, the climate intensified. The cathedral was forced to use much more potent counter-revolutionary forces to try and stifle our mass awakening. If the high school curriculum wasn't definitive in convincing whites they were hated, college certainly finished the job. It unashamedly preached a universal disdain for whites in Western culture by all the hegemonic institutions. And it wasn't mere theory anymore. There were now segregated graduation events at the request of the colored students. This on top of microaggressions, safe spaces, land acknowledgements, gender-neutral bathrooms, all of it had created an environment that was so foreign from what our liberal world was supposed to be that we couldn't help but conclude with decisiveness that the old world, which had once been promised, was gone and perhaps never existed to begin with. The left now wanted to scare us into submission. Antifa was routinely organized and deployed at all conservative events. Physical conflict would exclusively land the right-wing participants in jail for years, and yet anyone on the left would be free of all consequences. It was now officially a two-tiered society, and we were explicitly pushed to the side, and we were told we must accept this subjugation willingly, or else we'd be kicked out of school, lose all job prospects, and be socially radioactive. But over time, this rejection had a paradoxical effect, because it soon began to build a fairly large, yet still disorganized coalition of young white men. These boys had been mocked, ridiculed, and denied their entire adult life. And they all sat there in silence, totally confused about what had happened to them through no fault of their own. These young white boys were all promised equality of opportunity. They were promised to be judged based on their merit. And they promised to do the same thing in return. And yet, here the opposite was being done to them. They were being shunned only because of their race. Denied from the things they had worked so hard for and made all the sacrifices to get. It made no sense anymore. But these boys were still a long ways away from the far right. They'd certainly call their friends slurs, but they'd also insist proudly that they would never judge anyone because of their race. They might make some gay jokes every now and then, but they likely believed something along the lines of love was love. And they'd even wonder, why would anyone want to hold back two honest people that wanted to get married just like everyone else? And this type of logic caused a lot of young men to consider themselves to be something like a libertarian, whether they defined it that way or not. They drew upon this liberal society, which was built on consent-based morality and blank slateism, and so by extension, they believed that everyone should get a fair shot, regardless of immutable characteristics or preferences. You'd soon hear a lot of them say that they believed in the vision of the founders. They'd announced their commitment to judging individuals as individuals. They accepted nearly all lifestyle choices, so long as there weren't immediate negative effects on others. And with this framing, they would come to ultimately fetishize a false definition of liberty. Many would defend legalizing all drugs, gambling, or prostitution, and all those vices which are so frequently disguised as freedoms. But then the culture took its mile from the inch we gave. It became extremely obvious, even for non-observers, that we had been deceived once those parades started to pick up. Degeneracy was now blatantly promoted and celebrated. This was not exactly what was originally sold as gay rights, the right to pee on other men in public. What exactly were these rights they were demanding? But it was really with the trans explosion that led so many young men to realize this wasn't just something that had been stifled by an oppressive and backward society. This was some type of inversion of the natural state of things. And the fascination that this group had with children and the insistence that they got unfettered access to women's bathrooms only expedited that realization. And as it became clear that the public sentiment was shifting, many gays desperately tried to divorce themselves from the trans portion of their movement. But it had become quite clear to us that any form of these proclivities was not just a simple difference in preference. They weren't born this way. At its root, this was indulgence in vice. It was deviancy, and any degenerating deviancy stops nowhere but the depths of hell. The insistence that these gay men just wanted to go home to their house behind their white picket fence and have missionary sex after a long day of contributing to society was obviously false. And all of a sudden, there were quiet whispers about this stuff. And it seemed that the tides were maybe turning. But the culture kept getting more and more gay, deviant, and indulgent of any and all sexual perversions. And it was pushed in every domain. We've all seen the books being shown to young elementary school children. We knew this was not okay, but it had all snuck up on us. By the late 2010s, gayness, androgyny, and sexual fluidity was now a staple of nearly every prominent movie character, television ad, and pop star. And the girl boss was now the hero of our world, with their gay or trans sidekick to help propel them into their rightful place at the top of the hierarchy. Straight white men were now totally isolated. You couldn't find a single advertisement with a straight white guy that didn't have them looking like a complete moron or wimp. Anything that even toyed with being masculine became slandered and stamped as toxic. And as a man, you couldn't break free from these accusations just by doing your own thing and minding your business. We were forced to participate in and even fund our own subjugation. But just as these white Gen Z men were on the verge of being snuffed out and disenfranchised to the point of impotence, we saw Jordan Peterson's lectures catapult to prominence. And these hopeless young men were drip-fed an elixir which promoted strength from someone who would at least treat us like we were men and not defective women. And this message told us to actually do something, rather than wallow or defer to the feminist world surrounding us. What became obvious later was that this message, like Trump's, was only revolutionary when it was juxtaposed to a world full of absurd lies. Otherwise, the message is basic and instinctual. But these benign proclamations of truth had such an effect because our culture had become so unbelievably contrived, stale, and feminine. We were starving for something. Whether we understood it or not, we needed some type of authenticity and masculinity on a cultural scale. Good parenting was not enough. But despite the efforts, there would never be strong enough programming to persuade us that if we wanted to be real men, then we needed to make sure and recycle our fucking trash or something. And so, with that small spark lit by Jordan, we saw the faux masculine men begin to blossom. Joe Rogan's podcast had erupted into the mainstream. Here was a seemingly tough, rugged, muscular guy who didn't immediately cater to the tone policing and approved topics of MSNBC. Somehow, this was something we hadn't seen before in recent years. Looking back, it really was an incredibly low bar, but it initiated a shift, and it allowed us to understand that we didn't have to adhere to the rules of someone else's acceptable discourse. Joe and his guests were now having what was, at the time, considered to be the forbidden conversations. Masculinity was no longer entirely off limits when this crew spoke, and it was exciting. We all thought at first that these were the great men of our age. They seemed smart, brave, and cutting. They didn't outright bow to the directives of the monolithic cultural forces. And because of this supposed heterodoxy, they then dubbed themselves the intellectual dark web. Very cringe looking back now. And it was at this time when the culture really started to turn to the right. Masculine energy started exploding, the UFC became hugely popular, lifting weights became an impressive hobby, it was almost respectable to reject woke shit publicly. The beta male was now mocked, and the era of the Sigma began. The suited up finance bro was no longer the ideal archetype for masculine men. The rogue, unorthodox, red-pilled guy who did his own thing was. But just as society seemed to really be making a true turn against the cultural leftist hegemony, the coronavirus hit. And the extent of the crackdown that came with it is pretty hard to reconjure up, honestly. But it was in this epoch where we saw nearly every institution lose its credibility. Whether it was the completely made-up 6-foot social distancing, lying about the virus origins, masks, or the fake and poisonous vaccines, the medical industry was exposed for being, at best, deviously maximizing profit through any means necessary, and at worst, a tool to manufacture governmental justification to use power with no civilian consent required. And the censorship to enforce these baseless mandates finally opened most people's eyes to the very real political measures being taken by the tech companies as well as the media. They were exposed as being essentially arms of the state. Rogan had his face turned green on CNN and was nearly deplatformed from YouTube over his benign comments. And anyone who really took a stand was absolutely nuked from orbit. Some of the other IDW types also tried to put up some sort of a fight. There was a variety of courage shown on it all. But despite any bravery we saw in response to the virus, almost none of the spokesmen from this faction were strong enough to overcome the true cultural struggle session that was to follow. Because not long after we were hit by that virus and locked in our homes, we saw the arrival, sacrifice, and subsequent resurrection of the Church of Anti-Racism's Messiah, George Floyd. The active lockdown measures were thrown out the window as leftists took to the street to destroy the United States. And they did it all with no repercussions. A group of entire city blocks in Seattle were taken over and proclaimed to be in an autonomous zone. Council members even broke into city halls to lead riots. The Summer of Love commenced as the NIH announced that racism was a public health crisis, thus justifying these violent mobs in the midst of a deadly pandemic. And yet, when the Canadian truck drivers peacefully protested in Canada against the vaccine mandates, they were debanked and thrown in jail. It was decried as racist to call for an illegal to show their ID to vote, but you now needed a vaccine card just to go to the gym. The blatant double standards were too much for the newly libertarian-minded Gen Z men, It wasn't enough to be apathetic to power anymore and to simply call for neutral institutions. We knew we were required to seize and hold positions of authority if we wanted to fix this. There was no option that would allow us to be left alone. We realized that these people wanted to control us whether we participated or not. Gen X and millennials may have been beaten into submission by the great societal forces, and they may have been injected with an allergy to power. But through the excruciating torture we had to endure at the hands of these freaks in our youth, the Gen Z men became immune to that type of propaganda. The type of propaganda that says we should let others have the power, that we should suffer in silence while we let the ones who know better make the decisions. Because our history had proven that we weren't capable. And we realized definitively, with the transgressions against us throughout the coronavirus response, that we had to fight fire with fire. We finally understood that the world is not, in fact, made up of people who just want to get along and coexist. And the Gen Z men came to understand that we have to revise our positions. We have to rethink everything. But if the coronavirus saga didn't properly show everyone what people were willing to do for power, the 2020 election certainly did. It was a stunningly shameless power grab by the left, which almost nobody on the right was actually prepared for. We thought, foolishly, that there may still be some unspoken rules each side abided by. But that was false. As we watched the cathedral prop up a literal corpse, implement clearly fraudulent voting measures, and win an election that made no sense to anyone watching. And this battle for control all culminated with the sitting president of the United States being banned on social media. And the federally instigated riot, which spurred the banning, ended with grandmas being thrown into solitary confinement as their constitutional rights were stripped. Another example of that precious piece of paper's power. And this was not even 6 months after every major US city was destroyed by rioters over the overdose death of a black criminal, while Donald Trump stood down after Sean Hannity told him that any federal action would destroy his chances at re-election. God forbid they call him a fascist again. And so with that inexcusable weakness, the left reclaimed power. But in actuality, it was the Biden presidency which probably expedited the transition of these young men away from a libertarian mindset more than anything else could have. The most red-pilling aspect of the Biden regime was when Mayorkas unlocked the border and let it flow. We saw the most eclectic group of third worlders imaginable storm through Eagle Pass in a straight-up conga line. And the conservative estimate is that 10 million people came through during those 4 years. I think it's much higher. And there wasn't even an attempt at an argument for this. No justification, just a blatant reopening of the gates of Toledo. The real argument was, of course, to destroy us. And any comments about the changing demographics as a result of this influx of immigrants was considered heretical. We listened as the regime went on about just how awful whites were, how mean we were to poor minorities, and yet all we would see online were videos of minorities and illegals beating the shit out of whites, robbing them, running into their cars, you name it. And it was never the other way around. There was backlash to all this, but it was purely online. And as a response, the bannings became endless. There was no terms of service anymore for these sites. The government would simply target a particularly effective dissenter and terminate their account with no explanation. Parler, a free speech alternative to Twitter, was kicked off the entire App Store almost as soon as it launched. It got so bad that in 2022, the regime even tried to create a disinformation governance board, otherwise known as the Ministry of Truth, just to try and deal with the dissent online. And this was all enough to finally red pill the previously politically apathetic Elon Musk. And it ended with him putting $44 billion up and buying Twitter. And despite the Elon hate, this is likely the only reason that we have seen the right-wing revolution continue in any meaningful way. Because once there was a platform that actually held some semblance of freedom, we saw the right wing rapidly evolve past the preset liberal boundaries of the political discourse. And we soon recognized that all these men who acted brave like Jordan weren't actually taking any real stand. They were in fact carefully flirting with the line between masculinity and liberal conformity. They just said enough to where they wouldn't really ruffle any feathers. And after seeing the continual capitulation from these dorks, The only real conclusion to draw was that they were either useless or outright subversive to the movement. These were the types that called for a strict return to a society of apathetic reason, emotionless rationality. They pleaded for all of us to return to a 1990s climate of neutralism, which they promised would allow everyone to live harmoniously in a consent-based society. Unfortunately, this was just not an option, because humans aren't machines. We needed men with strength to run society with actual rules and with an adherence to actual values. We needed true, independent strength, not the type of strength that was defined by liberal parameters. And whether it was consciously understood, it was now evident that there was a societal vacuum here. We were missing authentic boldness and bravery. These faux warriors had been exposed. And because no one else would step in, the force that immediately filled that power vacuum was Andrew Tate. And unsurprisingly, he instantly ascended to the top of the culture. He took the fake masculine message of Peterson and spun it into a hardened, actionable plan for young men. Essentially, get bitches, make money. For all you NPCs, I'm not claiming that's some type of moral approach, obviously. But it is a lot more appealing than go to a gay pride parade to show your solidarity and make sure you remove the cap from your water bottle before you recycle it. It was also more appealing than this pretend right wing that said, never judge anyone else unless they do something explicitly bad to you, and always just mind your own business. Tate was a fighter, someone who had demonstrated his courage in the ring. He had made money, he was ripped, women loved him, he wasn't just a construct. And he undoubtedly had at least 3 times the amount of aura that any other public figure had. And Andrew also commented on the elephant in the room, which most of the intellectual dork web pretty much ignored. The modern woman. The era of the girl boss had reached a boiling point just as Tate ascended. And we were all tired of it. Because while we were all demanded to respect these women, defer to their opinions, and let them have a seat at the table, we also had to use kid gloves with them. You were always one comment away from being fired in the office for creating an unsafe work environment. And men were simply done with this crap. We were no longer willing to cater to their bullshit fake jobs. We would no longer hold our tongues as they exuded a bizarre sense of superiority. And it was stomach churning to watch as they were unable to shoulder any real responsibility, yet often insisted that they should be president, all while being handed every single promotion through DEI. These women had all gone to state schools, majored in communications, got a 2.8, then went on to work as product managers at Expedia or Indeed. They made $125,000 a year, yet their entire workday was filled with getting free lattes and leaving early to vote for Zohran Mamdani. And we all had to stay silent as they boasted about their voting patterns, which always favored the suicide of civilization. And it was done with a smug smile as they then declared that being a stay-at-home mother would be far too beneath them, because ultimately, these women demanded the freedom to pick the parts of masculinity they wanted, yet preserve the elements of feminism that they still liked. The man had to be 6'4", make $300K a year, open the door and pay for meals. But how dare you ask them to cook dinner or even do the laundry? The men were still expected to have all the responsibility and all the blame when things went wrong. But the men were given none of the authority. They had the burden of everything important and yet never got to have the final say on anything. And Tate, as well as others like him, showed us that we did not have to just accept this premise anymore. Andrew also explained just how hopeless the economic situation was, and just how fake all the money was to begin with. Dollars weren't even being physically printed anymore. It was now just digits on a screen. And we watched as the money changers, banks, day traders, investment bankers all raked in millions without creating anything for the economy. Just clicks on a computer and bumps in the bathroom. We saw all this happen before us while our dollars lost purchasing power by the day and every single price tag went up along with it. And we realized if it's all fake anyway, then what's the fucking point here? We can't buy a house without being enslaved to debt for life. $100K a year barely pays the bills in a big city. Stocks are entirely fake. And no one has any idea how it's even possible that our national debt can somehow be nearly double all the dollars in circulation. We knew we had to try to get rich if we wanted to break out of this matrix, but it seemed like the only way to do it was to scam people or literally just get lucky on crypto. Success looked to be just the result of either gambling or inheritance. Things were feeling incredibly hopeless. And then, in 2024, Trump made his comeback. And I'll admit, It was an incredible comeback. And a lot of us were cautiously optimistic despite the red flags. We thought that maybe Trump had learned his lesson by now. He might finally know how the game was played. And we prayed that he could actually help fix things this time. We wanted to believe that the greatest political forces of the era were all coalescing against party lines to battle this rot that had become so entrenched in our political system. But soon, we realized that it was all for nothing. Because after only a few months from being sworn in, we watched the supposedly most anti-war and America First president in history decide that the US would be bombing Iran, purely at the request of our greatest ally, Israel. We were also waiting patiently for the release of the Epstein files, which Trump had campaigned so hard on releasing. We thought he and Pam Bondi would finally expose and skewer these sick pedophiles. But instead, he called it a Democrat hoax. And so we learned in actuality that this entire administration was running cover for child rapists, while telling us that we were the problem for taking issue with it. And in those moments, we finally realized that nothing can actually change this system from the inside, no matter who's in charge. And that revelation was perhaps the most radicalizing and revolutionary moment of all. Our solution would have to be external. And so with that, we have arrived in this moment, in a country that has been pillaged, spat on, sold out, and replaced, and the very people that have suffered these transgressions have been the ones blamed for it. And now, the young men of Gen Z, who were once equality and freedom-loving liberals that just wanted to go surfing or hang out with their friends, have been forced into becoming right-wing authoritarians that are willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. But let's not forget just how exceptionally patient we've been during our evolution. We sat by and let everyone make their own choices. And we held good on our promise that we wouldn't judge people for things that didn't affect others. Then we saw gays chant proudly about coming for our children, and drag queens showing porn to kids in school as liberal white women cheered. We let minorities and immigrants bitch and moan about the most accepting nation that's ever existed, one that has literally committed suicide just to allow for others to join to avoid being mean. Then we saw hordes of Indians come in and steal our tech jobs, hollow out each of the companies and turn them into little Indian colonies as they shat on America and whites, while Trump called for stapling green cards to every diploma. We sat quietly on the sidelines as DEI robbed our brightest minds of the most sought-after positions, and we watched as everybody in those roles failed and made a complete mockery of our institutions as a result. We continue to suffer through the competency crisis these idiots created, which has destroyed the functionality of everything from airports to customer service lines. We even believed that Jewish people were just persecuted victims who wanted to be part of the American dream. Then we sat stunned as we discovered that it was in fact Jewish Americans who were funding mass immigration facilitating NGOs and writing books about how evil whites were. We saw the honorary Israeli Larry Ellison buy TikTok and half the entire world media apparatus as a personal favor to Netanyahu. And we stood by as the Israeli Prime Minister made it a point to bring his dirty fucking laundry all the way across the Atlantic Ocean so the White House staff could wash it. We listened to liberals claim that they were just showing compassion for people down on their luck as they defended releasing criminals and letting homeless people wander the streets. We heard them say that these people have just had it rough, but they deserve a second chance. Then we saw the sweet and innocent Irina stabbed in the neck by a crazed black man with infinite prior arrests, for no other reason than being a white girl. We heard blacks complain for years that they were the poor victims of systemic racism and that they just wanted to be equal. And then we saw Carmelo Anthony stab Austin Metcalf over a seat at a track meet, and then watched as his family raised $500,000 in a GoFundMe, and instead of paying for legal bills, they bought a house and who knows how many fucking pairs of Jordans. We tried to give women a seat at the table, but we watched as Mackenzie Bezos and Laurene Jobs donated the billions of dollars made by their husbands to left-wing groups that fund our own society's destruction. We stayed true to honest debate, to the marketplace of ideas, as we challenged the left to discuss their ideas with us. We knew that our perspective created a better world, and we were confident we could persuade others away from the leftist path that they had been misled into taking. And then we saw Charlie Kirk get shot in the neck for it. But most importantly, we saw them cheer. And so, with all that we've seen, we are finally done listening or blindly trusting in good faith. We are finished giving others the benefit of the doubt, and we are certainly finished putting ourselves last. We will not allow these social experiments to be run when the result is the destruction of our country, especially when the only consequence of the responsible parties is to have them throw their hands up and say, oops, if we even get that at all. We are done being told that ideas are off limits, because the ideas that aren't off limits are absolute dog shit. And so, we don't care about your sacred cows anymore because we have none. We want outcomes that serve us. We are not married to some procedure like the generations past. Our goal isn't to follow some rule book so that if we lose, at least we can say we lost honestly. If the Constitution isn't getting us the outcomes or protections we need, then it might be time for it to go. I can almost hear the gasp of the beautiful losers on the right. How dare he? Well, how fucking dare you? How dare any of you defend these structures that either outright facilitated this outcome or were too weak to prevent it? Both options are definitively invalidating. We will take the steps needed to right this ship, and we are prepared to venture down whatever road can get us there. Because what all these events have led to, ironically, is a generation that is actually the most open-minded perhaps ever. We truly don't care anymore about what's off limits. Someone wants to make the case for Franco or Mussolini, we'll hear them out. You want to challenge our sacred democracy? Maybe you want to make the case for monarchy? We'll hear that out too. We no longer have a knee-jerk reaction to certain ideas, words, or people. At this point, all we want are the right outcomes, and we're willing to discard or add whatever strategy or ideology is required to get those results. We will absolutely preserve the fundamentals of our morality in the quest to achieve this, obviously. But finally, there's a demographic that's no longer petrified by these secular satans that have been constructed and deployed to restrain the minds of Americans. It's funny that the left is freaking out over Trump's actions right now, because anyone tapped into the Gen Z male movement knows with certainty that we think Trump is a weak cuck. Someone who has no political will at all, not a true leader, not even close to capable of doing what needs to be done, not even close. And we, the Gen Z men, absolutely can't wait until one of us rises up, because we aren't afraid to actually wield power. That is where we are, and that is how we got here. And Gen Z, unlike those before us, are playing to win.